Emmerdale that hasn't aired on ITV1 yet, but can be viewed on ITVX. Robert Sugden, Ryan Hawley, and Aaron Dingle, Danny Miller, are back in Emmerdale from their latest break, and they're making big plans for the future as they try to put their recent turbulent past behind them. Robert has already moved his stuff into Aaron's flat, and in Monday, December 22nd, episode he decided that it was time he got to know his long-lost son, Seb. Sebastian White currently lives in Bristol with his aunt, following the death of his mother Rebecca White in 2024. Prior to Rebecca's death, Seb had been living with her and her then partner, Ross Barton Mike Parr. The boy also visited Robert and Aaron regularly. When Robert was sent to prison, Rebecca felt it was best to cut off ties with Emmerdale completely, meaning that Robert hasn't seen his son in a number of years. Ross was furious to hear from Seb's Aunt Angela that Robert had been in touch about seeing the boy. He told Aaron and Robert that he'd been more of a dad to Seb than Robert ever had, and he'd advised Angela not to let Robert anywhere near him. Seb deserved a quiet life, he said, which wasn't something Robert and Aaron could offer him. How many psycho husbands have tried to kill you both lately? He reminded them, and he has a point. No sooner had they recovered from Aaron being dragged off a cliff by his husband, deranged medic John Sugden, Oliver Farnworth, than they were having to deal with Robert's past sentence, sat on them both like a shadow that sometimes lengthened overnight. But Robert's face tonight had a different softness, the kind that comes when a man decides he will no longer run from his mistakes. Seb, Robert said. I want to meet him. Properly. I wrote to Angela. She's agreed to meet, to see if he can visit. If we can show them we can give him a calm life. Aaron swallowed. Calm. Right. That's a laugh, isn't it? He tried to smile, but there was a tremor beneath it. Not just in his lips, but in the small tightness of his chest that never quite eased. The word calm had been a domestic chimera for years. Threatened by jealous outbursts, broken loyalties, a former life with fists and threats that still left aftershocks in their bones. We'll be calm, Aaron told him. We'll be better. They knew Sebastian White lived in Bristol. Seb had been moved away after Rebecca's death in 2024. Ross Barton had been vocal in the household about being the more dutiful father figure while Rebecca was alive. Ross had his own jagged history with the village. A volatile, bruised man whose loyalty to the people he cared for could feel both fierce and dangerous. He'd told anyone who would listen that he had done for Seb what Robert had never done. He'd told Robert and Aaron that they were too volatile, that they could never give the boy the quiet life he deserved. Robert had always worked to keep himself contained. He had loved recklessly in the past and had paid for it. He looked older than his years now, every laugh line a ledger entry of mistakes. When Angela, Seb's aunt, had agreed to a meeting, he felt his chest tighten. No sudden moves. No speeches. Just the truth delivered quietly. He wanted to be a father now. Not everyone accepted the truth at face value. Ross's face hardened the first time Robert called. You want to see him? Ross spat down the line. After everything? Who are you kidding? They had a run-in in the street, raised voices, accusations fired like frozen stones. Ross warned Robert off. He talked to Lewis later, and because men sometimes find safety in confession, he admitted that giving Seb up had felt like a betrayal of Rebecca, like failing the woman whose trust he had once sworn to preserve. He had regrets. That only made him more determined to hold on to Seb now. Aaron tried to be the reasonable one. He drove to the spot where Ross's van was often parked and asked him, quietly, bluntly, if they could try. That Seb deserved choices, that he deserved the chance to meet his father like anyone else. Ross's jaw tightened. He didn't budge. Then someone smashed Aaron's windscreen. The sound of it was like a punctuation, a sudden, brutal exclamation that left the afternoon hollow. Aaron found the shards like winter frost across the dash. He felt every old fear sharpen. Ross did it, he said flatly, though he had no proof. It was the most convenient suspect. Ross had motive. He had been angry enough. But suspicion is a treacherous thing. It covers you like a blanket and hides the truth. Later, Robert made the call to Angela. She agreed to meet them both at the Woolpack to see whether the village life might accommodate a tentative visit from Seb. There was a thread of hope that felt tender enough to snap. When they walked to the pub together, hands just brushing, then firmly clasped, there was a film of sunlight on the frost. For a moment, it felt like everything might hold. They walked into the Woolpack arm in arm. The smell of mulled ale, the laughter of darts players, Christmas decorations overhanging like forgiving ghosts. Robert waved, then froze. Aaron followed his gaze and found the edge of a crooked shadow. A man behind a tree across the street, hands jammed into the pockets of an old coat, head bowed as if to hide his face. It could have been anyone. But as Robert stepped closer, the man's jaw jutting out like a stubborn cliff, Robert recognized the slight hunch of Kev Townsend. Kev was not a name that had been laid to rest in the village quietly. He had been Robert's prison husband, the man who had shared the tight world of barred windows and fluorescent light. In a life that seemed to revolve around second chances and ugly histories, Kev represented the yet unhealed. The person who had met Robert in the dark and had been promised warmth, only to be left out in the cold when Robert's loyalties shifted. Kev's face as he watched Robert and Aaron going into the woolpack did not suggest forgiveness. It suggested a plan. He was back in Emmerdale like a bruise you couldn't ignore. For Robert, the sight of Kev there was a physical thing, as if someone had reached through him and plucked a raw spot. Kev's presence meant more than a smashed screen. It meant unfinished business, a record that hummed with quiet, dangerous notes. Robert tried to brush it aside. He and Aaron went into the pub. Kev remained where he was, silent as an accusation. That evening, the village moved through its usual orbit. The postman whistled at a caroler. Children shoved their noses to the window to watch the snow begin. Robert stayed close to Aaron. He spoke carefully with Angela on the phone, the words linear, rehearsed. "We can give him a quiet life," he said. We will." Those were hopeful words, like paper boats placed in a slow stream. On the other side of town, Kev was sharpening intentions into plans. Christmas in Emmerdale has always had a habit of magnifying things. Joy flares, grievances glow. On December 25th, a pale sunrise slid over the valley, catching frost on telegraph lines. Inside Aaron and Victoria's home there was a warmth forged from cooking, cups of coffee steam-wreathed, an odd mixture of presents that read like apologies and promises. Robert woke early, tying a scarf around his neck with the seriousness of a man about to make a pilgrimage. "Gotta pop out for a bit," he told Aaron without the lighter cadence he usually used. Aaron blinked. "On Christmas? What is it?" Robert avoided his gaze. "Just an errand. Something I need to sort. I'll be back soon." It wasn't the most transparent reassurances. But trust is an odd, resilient creature. Aaron swallowed the little knot of worry and offered Robert a smile that might have been a benediction. He did not know how quickly the prayer would be needed. Minutes became a cautious expanse. Robert's absence, at first an odd irritation, stretched into a chasm. He did not return. The milk went cold in the jug. Aaron called his number. It went to voicemail. "Where is he?" Victoria asked finally, her voice threaded with a rising panic. Aaron tried to sound steady. "He'll be fine. He said he'd be back." He paced back to the window. Outside, footprints ribboned the frost. Near the lane, the snow had a different pattern, a shuffle, an abrupt smear that suggested a scuffle. Someone had moved fast, erratically. They went out to look. At the lane they found the first bruise of trouble. Robert's phone lying face down, screen cracked, half buried in the mud. Nearby, a smear of dark red on the edge of the hedge glinted in the low sun. Not enough to call it conclusive, but enough to make breath catch. The tracks led away from the pub, toward the river and the narrowing path that skirted it. They were not tracks of a calm stroll. They were jagged, angry prints that showed someone had been hauled, dragged, forced. Panic had a salt taste. Aaron didn't wait for the police. He called Lewis and sent an urgent message to Victoria. "Robert's missing. I think he's been taken." Lewis arrived, practical and pragmatic, boots scuffing the frozen track. "Who would do this?" he demanded. Aaron's mind ran hot with suspects. Ross for his fury about Seb, John, the medic whose hands had once become weapons, old enemies of Robert's from before his incarcerations. His gaze cut to the trees where Kev had stood the day before, where his silhouette had looked like a promise of trouble. It was a thought that the others might have dismissed were it not for the cracked phone and the smudge of red. "Kev," Aaron said, and the word felt like a stone dropped into still water. They found Kev quickly. He had not gone far. He was at the edge of a disused quarry, hunched beside the jagged mouth where water had once eaten at the stone. He looked more like a man waiting for confession than for a fight, dirt on his hands and eyes that were glass-bright with something like calculation. Aaron charged, fury and fear braided together. "Where is he?" he demanded, very close now, his voice a piece of bone. Kev looked at him as if waking. For a moment there was only the creak of the wind in the pines and the soft drip of thawing ice. Then he said, without anger, "He went with me." Words fell like thunder. Aaron staggered. "What? You took him?" Kev smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the sort of smile that preened over pain. "I needed to keep him away. From all of it. From the mess. From you. From Sugden's lot. You took Robert, Victoria repeated, voice small. Why? Kev's reasons came out in a staccato spill. He said Robert had promised him things behind bars, that they had been something like a lifeline in a place where daylight had been rationed. Robert had left, the world had swallowed him back in, leaving Kev to rot in the space between promises and deliverance. He had loved Robert in the way of people who have nothing else. Vengeance, for him, had always been a strange twin of protection. I thought if I kept him away, Kev said, he'd be mine. Or at least I could make him pay. But this was not only bitter possessiveness. Kev spoke of Seb, too, the boy who had come to mean different things to different men. He had seen Robert's attempts to reach out, and he had felt the old, raw injustice crack like ice. Robert's life, fragmented and lived in flashes, had skated over people's lives and left little nets of ruin. Kev had thought that by taking Robert they would stop the reoccurrence of pain. It was lunacy dressed in a twisted kind of logic. You don't get to do this, Aaron said, voice splitting with the force of it. You don't get to decide who can see who. You don't get to hurt him to prove something. Kev's shoulders sagged, like a man buckling under the weight of his own reflection. He was not a monster in a fantasy tale. He was a man made monstrous by neglect, by promises fractured into sharp things. He had a pistol in his pocket, a detail any sane person would not miss, and a readiness in his hands that made the hairs on Aaron's arms rise. The threat was real. It was not posturing. A struggle unfurled then, not cinematic, but intimate and ugly. Kev lashed out, desperation moving through him like electricity. Aaron pinned him. Lewis gripped Kev's arm. The pistol clattered at their feet, and in its fall it was a small, ordinary thing, and yet it showed how close the village had come to a different ending. When the dust sat for breath, Robert was sitting on a boulder by the quarry's edge, hands on his knees, face sallow and eyes wide in a way that was close to shame and exhaustion. He had a cut above his lip and a bruise on his temple. He looked like a man reconciling with the consequences of a long night. You idiot, Aaron said, and it was a soft thing, a torn stitch. He fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around Robert, as if by doing so he could pull all the cracked pieces back into a whole. Robert did not fight it. He trembled like a child who had been away too long from shelter. I had to go, he said, words thick. I thought I could sort him out. I thought if I fixed things with Kev, if I showed him I wasn't the same, he'd back off. I didn't mean to cause this. You went alone, Aaron said, fingers in his hair. On Christmas. You went alone. Outside in a lower valley, a clock chimed 12:30, and a church bell somewhere answered with a sound like regret. Kev sat on the other side of the circle of men, hands shackled, his posture full of a strange, bitter dignity. His revenge had been sought, but what it had produced was not triumph. It had produced fear and hurt, and a reminder that past sins have long arms. Angela arrived later, with Seb's photograph clutched in her hands. She had seen the headlines online, the ITVX release had set the village talking. And she had come because adults must see how children are never just part of other people's battles. Seb was not present. He was in Bristol with a life that held its own quiet fractures. But the scandal, the near-miss, had been loud enough to make her rethink the immediacy of any decision. Robert spoke to her like someone praying. He told her every admission truthfully. The prison, the mistakes, the men he'd loved and lost, the way his life had overturned. He spoke of the errand that had turned into a blunder. His attempt to find Kev, to make peace or at least to pin down a man who might become a threat during their attempt to see Seb. It had been a dangerous miscalculation. He had meant well. He had meant to keep Seb safe by quelling the unpredictable. Angela listened, her face an atlas of worry and weary love. Seb deserves calm, she said finally, voice steady like stone. But he also deserves honesty. If you want him to have a place in your life, we must know you can keep him safe. The parables of small villages are often written in twos. The intimate cruelty of betrayal and the tender cruelty of redemption. Kev's reappearance had been the sharp, sinister revelation. It had also been a wake-up call. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.